Tonight, in the space of deep sleep of power, we draw near to a man whom history still cannot lay down with a quiet sigh of rest. There are figures who, the farther they recede from their own age, the clearer their portrait becomes. But some pass through the world like a hot wind over the sand. The more years go by, the less their footprints remain still within any fixed shape. Muammar Gaddafi was such a man. To some, he was a dictator who left behind collapse and fear. To others, he was the leader who pulled people out from the shadow of colonial humiliation, who used oil to raise schools, hospitals, roads, and even great dreams in the middle of the desert. Some saw him as a revolutionary of the Arab world. Others remembered only darkness, ruin, and the tragic end of a dynasty that would not step down when the time had come. And perhaps it is precisely for that reason that the story of Gaddafi cannot be told in too loud a voice, nor should it be closed by too hasty a judgment. Tonight, we will not come to him as one comes before a statue to offer praise, nor will we come as if stepping into a courtroom to pronounce guilt. We will only sit down a little more slowly and look for a long while into a life that once held too many things at once: the humiliation of a nation invaded, the pride of the desert, the dream of sovereignty, the ambition to rewrite politics, monumental works, and also the long shadow that power can cast over a human soul. How did a Bedouin boy, born among desert tents, raised with hot winds, wells, and herds of livestock, become a man who would make the entire world argue for decades? Why did someone once seen as a symbol of national dignity also become a symbol of isolation and collapse? And how was it that, amid colossal projects, revolutionary slogans, strange garments, continental summits, and nights of bombs and gunfire, one question still refused to sleep? In the end, who was Gaddafi in history? A builder, a destroyer, or a man who had gone too far into the dream of his own making? If you love stories that do not rush, historical portraits told in a slow, deep, and reflective cadence, give Deep Sleep of Power a subscription and travel with the channel through nights like this. Nights when history does not shout, but only gently opens like an old door in the wind. To understand a man like Gaddafi, we cannot begin with the throne, oil, or the great forums of the world. We must go farther back towards silence, where the sand still holds the heat of the day, where a small tent stands alone beneath the Libyan sky, and where the first cry of a child rang out in the desert, as if fate had chosen for him, from very early on, a path that would never be peaceful. If we wish to understand a man like Muammar Gaddafi, perhaps we should not begin with podiums of speech, military uniforms, conference tents set upon the stage of world politics, or the years in which his name rang out like a call that divided. We should return more slowly, farther back, lower down, return to the place where a child first opened his eyes beneath the sky of Libya, not under a ceiling of wood or stone, but beneath the cloth of a tent trembling softly in the desert wind. There, childhood had very little shade. There was only sand. Sand stretched so far that it seemed the earth had forgotten how to be gentle to human feet. There was only sunlight, the kind of sunlight that spoke no words, yet taught very early that life is a quiet endurance. There were only wells, remembered with a gratitude as deep as one remembers a mercy granted by fate. There were only goats, camels, the footfalls of livestock, brief calls exchanged in the late afternoon, and nights so cold that the small flame inside the tent became the center of the whole world. Gaddafi was born into that space, the space of the Bedouin, People who lived closer to the wind than to walls, closer to the sky than to public squares, closer to the tribe than to the rigid institutions of the city. This was not merely a way of life. It was a way of feeling one's way through human existence. For the Bedouin, honor was not a beautiful word spoken in ceremony. It was something guarded as one guards water in a vessel during a season of drought. Freedom was not a slogan. It was the feeling of refusing to let one's soul be tied to the will of another. The tribe was not merely a blood relation. It was the place where a person knew he belonged and who would stand beside him when the wind changed direction. In that world, the city was often regarded with caution because it brought unfamiliar power, taxes, commands, and ways of living that nomadic people felt could easily make a human being forget his roots. And foreigners almost always entered memory in a form colder than compassion. Such a childhood does not produce a fragile soul. It creates people who know how to endure, be silent, remember, and carry within themselves a pride that is very difficult to bend. We can imagine that boy growing up among days that seemed almost identical, waking in the morning to harsh light, filtering through the tent cloth, hearing the adults speak in short, sparse phrases, stepping onto sand that still held the cold of the night, then watching the sun climb high like a king who never grew weary. But within that dry repetition, a structure of mind was slowly being formed. The desert has its own way of educating. It does not teach from books. It teaches by emptiness. It does not teach by theory. It teaches by lack. It does not teach people to speak much. It teaches them to keep in the heart the things that still cannot be called by name. Perhaps that is why, throughout the many upheavals of his later life, Gaddafi always carried with him some part of that old tent of sand. Even when standing in the capital, amid national ceremonies, motorcades, and meeting rooms filled with air conditioning, he still seemed to want to preserve the image of a man who came from the desert. A man who did not fully belong to Western-style cities, who did not entirely trust the glitter of imported models, and who always regarded the severe simplicity of Bedouin life as a kind of moral credential for himself. But that childhood left behind more than style. It left behind a way of seeing the world. Those who grow up amid barrenness do not forget the value of the things that keep human beings alive. Water, food, shelter, loyalty, dignity, all these appear more concrete, heavier, more real, and precisely because they have once lived so close to want, they often find it hard to accept the sight of their people bowing before others. In a child born in a tent of sand, self-respect is not taught through textbooks. It seeps into the flesh the way desert dust settles into the folds of clothing. That is why, when one looks back at Gaddafi's later path, one sees many things that seem contradictory, yet in truth spring from the same root. His longing for sovereignty, his suspicion of the West, his instinct to elevate the tribe, his belief that a nation must stand on its own feet, even the way he liked to appear in a tent at international forums. None of these were decorative details. They were distant echoes of childhood. That childhood also made him different from many leaders born out of libraries, academies, or the corridors of empire. Gaddafi did not mature in rooms lined with books, where people debated through neat concepts. He matured in a world where one had to learn how to survive before learning how to reason. Therefore, at his deepest level, he carried the imagination of the desert, vast, bold, full of symbol, yet also inclined to believe that a strong will can bend reality. And perhaps it is from here that we begin to understand why, within this man, idealism and hardness always walked side by side, like two shadows in the late afternoon. But the desert was not the only hand laid upon that childhood. Beyond the hot wind and the smell of livestock, beyond the tent and Bedouin pride, there was something else quietly entering the memory of Libya, a wound that did not come from the sand, but from the sea. The sea often evokes horizons and hope, but for many families upon this land, some waves did not bring peace. They carried instead the shadow of ships, the sound of nailed boots, fire, and the memory of those who came from beyond the horizon to teach a people what it means to be trampled upon in their own homeland. Some nations grow not only on bread, water, and a mother's lullaby, they also grow on the memory of what has been taken from them. For Libya, part of that memory sank into the soil, into the stories told by the elderly, into the eyes that dimmed too quickly whenever the years were mentioned, when the coastline was no longer a place that welcomed the wind, but had become the place where strange ships arrived, carrying darkness with them. The sea often suggests openness, but there are moments in history when the sea brings neither commerce nor knowledge, nor friendship between civilizations. It brings uniforms, commands, gunfire, prison camps, and the familiar coldness of an empire convinced that it has the right to step upon the fate of others. When Italy invaded Libya at the beginning of the 20th century, it was not only the territory that came under attack. What was touched more deeply was dignity. Land was seized, communities were driven away, wells were controlled, livestock was slaughtered, and the lifelines of the nomadic people were severed as one cuts the ropes, holding down a tent in a hard wind. Under colonial rule, and later under Fascism, Libya did not merely lose the right to determine its own course. Libya was forced to live with the feeling that even the breath drawn in its own homeland could be measured by someone else. And perhaps the deepest pain is not always the loudest explosion. At times, historical suffering enters human life in far quieter ways. A meal diminished because the herd is no longer there. A father returning with fewer words after a sweep through the area. A mother speaking the name of a lost relative in a voice so soft, it seems afraid to stir the wind. A child understanding too early that there are people who come from very far away, yet can decide the fate of his village from such a terrible nearness. Wounds like these do not always remain in chronicles. They remain in life, and because they remain in life, they endure far longer than reports or speeches. In Libya's collective memory, those years were not merely the colonial period. They were a long season of humiliation and endurance. Concentration camps, repression, exhausted villages, columns of people driven away as if they were no longer masters of the sand, the water, or the sky to which they had once belonged. There are nations that, when defeated, lose their wealth. There are nations that, when defeated, lose something more painful still, the feeling that the world sees them as human beings among equals. And once that is wounded, the pain does not end with a single generation. It is passed down. It passes from a grandfather telling stories to his grandchildren beside a small fire. It passes through stories of fallen resistors whose names sometimes live longer than their graves. It passes in the way people look at foreigners with eyes at once wary and remembering. It passes in the belief that freedom, if not guarded with firmness, will sooner or later be taken away by another, stronger hand. Gaddafi grew up in such an atmosphere. Even though he was born after the most brutal phase of the Italian conquest, he still breathed an air thick with the smell of old ash. The stories of occupation, of the dead, of humiliation, of blood and sand, were not to him a history confined to books. They were memories living inside the community. They entered the mind of a child, not as facts, but as feelings. And once such a feeling takes root, it is often far stronger than argument. Perhaps that is why, later, in Gaddafi's mind, the West was rarely simply the outside world. It often appeared as the shadow of a collective experience that had never truly healed. For those born in nations once humiliated, every negotiation with foreign powers carries an invisible layer beneath it, the fear of being deceived, coerced, or forced to bow yet again. From that, the longing for sovereignty becomes something almost sacred. Not only the sovereignty of borders, but the sovereignty of voice, of resources, of honor. But it is also here that the seed of tragedy is quietly sown. For those who grow up too close to national humiliation often carry within themselves a very great vow, never again to let their people kneel. Such a vow can shape strong human beings willing to resist external pressure. But it can also lead a person to believe, little by little, that all of his hardness is justified, that every suspicion is necessary, that every form of opposition is questionable, so long as the nation remains standing upright. The line between protector and controller, therefore, does not always arrive in a single leap. Sometimes it comes through many small steps, nourished by painful memory, and by the belief that one is doing what cannot be avoided. In the desert night, perhaps people understand better than anyone that a wound left untended does not simply disappear into the wind. It dries, darkens, lies still, and goes on living beneath the skin as part of the body itself. Libya's history was much the same. It did not forget quickly. It did not sleep quickly. It remained there, smoldering beneath simple conversations, beneath the footsteps of livestock, beneath the outward calm of families who seemed only to be trying to live an ordinary life. And then, as with every deep wound, it did not cause pain alone. It created the longing to find a way out. Perhaps that is why, upon that arid land, there would come a time when a boy would no longer only listen to old stories beside a tent of sand. He would begin to walk toward words, toward schoolrooms, toward pages of books, and still unfamiliar cities. As though between two worlds, a soul were quietly learning how to carry the desert with it into a new age. There are paths toward knowledge that do not begin with the wide-open gate of a school, nor with the easy hand of a well-provided family resting upon a child's shoulder. There are roads to learning that open through patience, through self-consciousness, through small footsteps that must pass through the feeling of not belonging before they can arrive at understanding. For Muammar Gaddafi, that journey seems to have begun in such a way, not smooth, not straight, but like a trail of footprints upon the sand, often seeming as though the wind would erase them, yet somehow appearing again, stubborn, slight, but enduring. That boy was born into an illiterate family. This did not simply mean that there were few books inside the tent. It also meant that the distance between him and the world of the educated was far greater than any geographical span. Some children enter school as though stepping into a room that has long been waiting for them. But some children enter it as though crossing into someone else's territory, a place where the voices, the clothes, the manners, and even the confidence of others immediately make them understand that they come from somewhere considered lower, slower, rougher. Gaddafi grew up between two such worlds. On one side was the world of the desert, where people lived close to the instinct of survival, to tribal honor, to a simple yet sharp self-respect. like the desert wind itself. On the other side was the world of words, of schools, of the city, of modern standards that were gradually becoming the official language of a new nation. To move from one world into the other was not merely a matter of changing one's surroundings. It was a quiet movement of the mind, learning how to enter modernity without dissolving within it. Perhaps for that very reason, Gaddafi's years of study were not the story of a schoolboy gently finding joy in books. They resembled a passage through an invisible threshold. It is said that for a time, he had to sleep in a mosque to continue his education. That image, if we linger over it, carries something very distinctive. A boy with few material means, bearing the poverty of a nomadic family, lying down in a place of prayer, in the silence of night, as though knowledge came to him, not through comfort, but through endurance. There, learning was not a gift already placed in his hands. It was something he had to reach for, but school does not give a person knowledge alone. It also gives a person the feeling of being seen. For a Bedouin boy stepping into an environment where many of his classmates came from the city, the gaze of others could at times become a bitter lesson, no less powerful than any textbook. Children from educated families living in less harsh surroundings often found it easy to look down on whatever carried the smell of the desert, the accent, the habits of life, the initial awkwardness, even the silence. And it was precisely in such small frictions that Gaddafi's inner life must gradually have been shaped into a very particular tension, the desire to rise, but not to be assimilated, the desire to receive knowledge, but not to bow before values that looked down upon his own origins. This is a very important point in understanding the man he later became, for there are people who step into the modern world and love it entirely, but some enter it with caution, like someone who learns while also defending himself. Gaddafi seems to have belonged to the latter kind. He understood that if one wished to change a nation's fate, one could not remain forever in a tent of sand, relying solely on tribal memory. One had to learn to read, to understand the workings of the state, the army, politics, technology, and the media. But at the same time, he did not want that learning to turn him into a copy of Europe or America. He did not want modernization to mean westernization. He did not want books to make him forget the sand, forget the tribe, forget the humiliation that history had once laid upon his homeland. And so, his school years were not merely a process of accumulating knowledge. They were the formation of a deep contradiction, but also one full of energy. How to carry the benefits of the new age without trading away the soul of the old world. How to enter the modern state without becoming a stranger to the desert. How to take up the tools of the 20th century while still keeping within oneself the pride of a child raised among tents, goats, camels, and rare wells. Perhaps from here, a very particular kind of political imagination began to stir within him. Not the imagination of intellectuals formed in libraries, but the imagination of a man standing between two shores, one foot still sunk in the sand, the other already touching the tiled floor of a school. Such people are rarely satisfied with ready-made formulas. They want to reassemble the world in their own way. They want to create a path new enough not to fall behind, yet also distinct enough that they do not feel they are betraying the past. At that depth, Gaddafi's journey into education was not only a personal story. It reflected the anxiety of many post-colonial societies, learning from the stronger world, yet not wishing to live beneath its shadow, opening the door to modernity, yet not wishing to lose one's dignity, stepping into the future, yet still carrying painful memories as part of one's identity. In him, that tension was not resolved through gentle harmony. It was preserved, nourished, and turned into a smoldering source of momentum. And it was also in those very years that, from the pages of books, from the political atmosphere moving through the Arab world, from invisible waves passing through the radio and through the imagination of youth, another call began to arrive. It was no longer only the call of learning, but the call of collective honor, the call that told a young man his people did not have to live forever in a posture of submission, that perhaps somewhere beyond the desert, another man was speaking in a voice strong enough to awaken an entire generation to stand upright in the world. Some people enter our lives not through a handshake, not through a real meeting, but through a voice crossing the air, a voice coming from a small radio, from invisible waves slipping through the desert night, crossing borders, crossing low rooftops, even crossing the loneliness of nations that had lived too long in the shadow of others. For the young Muammar Gaddafi, Gamal Abdel Nasser arrived in just that way, not first as a statesman of Egypt, but as a call-awakening Arab pride that had long lain still beneath the dust of defeat and humiliation. We should remember that this was an age in which the Arab world was not only poor in material terms, it also carried within itself a very deep spiritual hollow. The colonial years, the divisions arranged by foreign powers, the aging monarchies, the borders drawn on maps by others, all of this had left in the hearts of many young Arabs a feeling difficult to name. The feeling that their people possessed history, memory, and self-respect, yet had still not found the right posture in which to stand before the new age. Then Nasser appeared. He did not speak only of politics. He spoke of dignity. And for young people growing up amid poverty, amid the memory of invasion, amid suspicion toward the West, that was a language far more powerful than dry lectures. Nasser gave them the feeling that the Arab world did not have to live as a backyard of the great powers, that Arabs could lift their heads, could determine their own course, could reclaim what history had seemingly rendered mute. The Suez Crisis of 1956, in particular, must have been etched into the mind of the young Gaddafi as a scene not easily lulled to sleep. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal and rose to challenge the forces that had long been accustomed to directing the region's fate, that act was not merely an economic or military decision. In the eyes of many Arabs, it was the moment when a nation said to the world, "We no longer wish to kneel." For a Libyan youth raised in a tent of sand, from the memory of colonial humiliation, from stories of foreign trampling, Nasser appeared almost as a model of restored collective honor. Perhaps there, Gaddafi saw a path, not the path of the scholar, not the path of the merchant, but the path of the man who believes that history does not change because people lament long enough, but changes when someone dares to place his hand upon the helm and turn the course of the ship. From that inspiration, politics was no longer for him a distant sphere. It began to become destiny. But what is worth noting is that Nasser attracted Gaddafi not only because of strength, but because of a kind of strength bound to the moral logic of the post-colonial age. Strength to reclaim a voice, to protect resources, to make a people once dismissed feel that they were still worthy of their own history. At that depth, Nasser gave the young Gaddafi a very concrete dream, that the Arab world could be reborn through will, through discipline, through revolutionary spirit, and through the belief that a nation should belong to its own people, not to an aging court or to interests tied to outside powers. From here, The flame within him began to take on a clearer shape. The young man who had once walked between two worlds, between desert and school, between tribal instinct and modern life, now found a bridge joining those two shores. Nasser gave him a language with which to name what he had long felt, but had not yet been able to express. Anti-imperialism, Arab unity, national sovereignty, the self-respect of those who had once been humiliated. And when a young man finds the right language for his unrest, his inner life often changes very quickly. Dissatisfaction is no longer a scattered feeling. It becomes direction. And so, Gaddafi did not stop at admiration. He began organizing small secret groups, gathering young men who shared the same fervor, the same belief that Libya could not continue lying still beneath an outdated order. Here, we can already see a trait that would follow him throughout his life. He was not content merely to explain the world. He wanted to intervene in it. He did not want simply to stand at the edge of history as an observer. He wanted to step into the middle of history as a man of action. Yet, like every great flame, Nasser's appeal left behind in Gaddafi more than one lesson. It did not sow in him only the ideal of liberation. It also planted in him a very strong faith in the role of the central leader, the one who can speak for the nation, embody the nation, and lead the nation through an age by a will almost forbidden to hesitate. In its early hours, that seed carried the beauty of hope. But later, it too could become the shadow that accompanies every ambition for excessive power. Even so, in the years of youth, what stood out most was still the bright awakening of a soul that had just found its first political idol. For Gaddafi, Nasser was like a torch passing through the long night of inferiority. He gave the young Libyan the feeling that a man born among dust and sand could still think on the scale of an entire region, that a people once dismissed could still step onto the great stage of history, and that what mattered was not only how poor one was, but how deeply one still believed in one's own dignity. Such thoughts, once they enter the heart of a young man, rarely remain still. They begin searching for form in discipline, in secrecy, in quiet preparation. Just as beneath the seemingly motionless surface of sand, hidden currents may have long been moving before the desert changes color at dawn. And in Libya, that dawn was drawing near, not first through cries of celebration, but through the footsteps of young officers walking in the dark, carrying within their chests a dream hot enough to change an entire nation. Some changes enter history by way of artillery, fire, streets flooded with shouting, and walls still trembling after the blast. But some changes arrive like a very quiet dawn, so quiet that when people open their eyes, the old world still seems to wear the same sky, while the power beneath it has already changed hands without anyone quite knowing when. The morning of September 1969 in Libya was so still, not because history lacked drama that day. On the contrary, it was precisely its silence that made people remember it for so long. A group of young officers, most of them not yet old, carrying on their shoulders neither the glory of a long dynasty nor the majesty that ritual had cultivated through generations, stepped together into a decisive moment with a belief both simple and powerful. This country could no longer continue living as it had before. At the center of that group was Muammar Gaddafi, the young man of the desert, of Nasser's radio voice, of nights spent nourishing within himself the dream that Arab dignity could not remain forever, only a sorrowful echo. What is striking is that the coup succeeded with almost no bloodshed. At first glance, That detail can make one feel strangely relieved. An aging dynasty closes, a new order opens, and between the two is not a rushing red river. But if one looks more deeply, it is precisely the relative calm of the beginning that gave that moment such a powerful allure. When power changes too quickly and meets almost no corresponding resistance, people easily begin to believe that history itself has chosen the victors. Perhaps the old age had truly grown weary, that perhaps a nation was ready to place its hope in faces still young. And indeed, at that moment, Gaddafi appeared as a promise. He was not the promise of velvet comfort, not the promise of delicate treaties written in the language of European drawing rooms. He was the promise of dignity restored, of a country no longer bowing too low before foreign interests, of a young Libya wishing to define itself rather than be defined by others. After the colonial years, after the memory of trampling, after the sense that the monarchy had grown old and distant from the people, the arrival of these young officers carried what many post-colonial nations had long desired: a new energy, a new voice, a firmness that could make a people feel they were standing a little straighter before the winds of history. One can imagine the feeling of many Libyans in those first days, as if standing before a rare rain after a season of drought. No one knew for certain how long the rain would last. No one knew whether it would nourish the land or eventually bring another flood. But in that first moment, people felt only the easing of dryness. They saw only a space of hope that had seemed not to be visited for a very long time. For Gaddafi, that victory was surely not only the success of a military plan, it was the confirmation that history could be turned by the will of those who were bold enough and believed enough. From a boy raised in a tent of sand, from a young man captivated by Nasser and the Arab dream, he now stepped into the center of power, as if the desert had at last found its own voice within the modern state. Perhaps within him at that moment, past and future met with great intensity. A Bedouin childhood, colonial memory, years of schooling shaped by both self-consciousness and longing, the flame of Arab honor, all of it converged in that bloodless dawn. But it is also here that a deeper question begins to emerge. Are all revolutions most beautiful in the morning? Does all power, when it first arrives, wear the face of salvation? And is the gentleness of the beginning sometimes only the way history hides the very long shadow that will later fall behind the victors? These are questions worth keeping in the heart when looking back on that moment in 1969. What happened that day was not merely a change of government. It was the opening of a period in which Gaddafi was no longer merely a man dreaming of power. He began to live inside power, breathe through power, think through power, and gradually, as so often happens with revolutionary leaders, learn to see himself as the indispensable bridge between the nation and its fate. But in those early days, people did not yet see the full extent of that shadow. What they saw more clearly was a group of young officers who had done what earlier generations had not. They saw a country change direction in a single night. They saw a new leader speaking in a voice closer to the nation's character, closer to Arab pride, and seemingly less dependent on the orbit of outside hands. In that atmosphere, hope was real, and that hope was not entirely without reason. For very soon after stepping into power, Gaddafi would confront a question larger than any slogan. If a people have suffered humiliation from too long being controlled by foreign powers, then what must first be reclaimed so that they may truly stand upright? It was not only the flag, not only speeches, not only political palaces. In the modern world, there was another bloodstream flowing beneath the country's feet. something dark, hot, heavy with scent, and powerful enough to make the great powers look back at the desert with different eyes. The dawn had passed. The first light of revolution was now beginning to touch the earth beneath. And under that layer of sand, which seemed so silent, oil was waiting to become the new language of sovereignty. There are nations that, for many years, look down at the earth only to cultivate it, to herd their animals, to find a well deep enough to carry them through the dry season. But there are also nations that one day look into the ground and realize that beneath it there is not only sand, not only stone, but also something dark, silent, pungent, and powerful enough to make the whole world change its tone when speaking to them. For Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, oil became such a thing. Not merely a resource, but a declaration that a nation once decided by others could begin learning how to stand upright through the very wealth lying beneath its feet. After the dawn that brought the young officers into the center of power, the greatest question was no longer simply who held the wheel of the country. The true question was, by what means would Libya reclaim its dignity? Speeches were not enough. Symbols were not enough. Pride alone was still not enough. In the modern world, national power does not flow only through armies or flags. It also moves through streams of money, contracts, tankers carrying energy, and the ability to compel the great powers to sit at the negotiating table on an equal footing. Gaddafi understood this very early. He understood that if Libya wished to cease being a land where outsiders came to extract wealth and depart with most of the benefit in their hands, then oil had to be drawn back closer to the Libyan state, closer to the Libyan people, closer to the feeling that this country had not been born merely to supply fuel for the prosperity of others. And so, reclaiming sovereignty over oil was not merely an economic policy. It resembled a ritual of restoring national honor. When the Libyan state applied pressure and negotiated more firmly with foreign companies, when the share of benefit was adjusted in a direction more favorable to the nation, what many people felt was not money alone. They felt a spirit. This time, the world was no longer speaking to Libya in the voice of a dispenser of favors. This time, Libya possessed something that could compel others to listen. This was a very deep psychological movement. For nations that have lived long in the shadow of colonialism, reclaiming resources is rarely a matter of budget alone. It is a matter of dignity. It is a matter of ensuring that the wealth born from one's own soil no longer flows away, as a river one can only stand beside and watch from the sandy bank. It is a matter of allowing people to begin believing that their country does not have to remain poor simply because history once wounded it. And for many Libyans in those early years, Gaddafi appeared as the man who had forced the world to adjust its posture before Libya. He was no longer merely the leader of a successful coup. He became a symbol of refusing to kneel. If we look very slowly, we will see that the appeal of this period did not lie in the numbers first. It lay in the feeling of reversed roles. The feeling that the negotiating side no longer consisted only of large corporations, strong governments, and hands long accustomed to issuing commands from afar, but also of a young, proud state telling them, "This stretch of sand is no longer your backyard." And indeed, oil opened a new horizon. From being something buried deep in the earth, silent as a secret of the desert, oil became the bloodstream, feeding the ambition of national reconstruction. It allowed the state to think of things that a poor country could scarcely imagine. Schools, hospitals, support for daily life, roads, housing, and even a welfare structure that could make people feel that the future was no longer as barren as the old seasons of sand. In those years, many Libyans must have sensed in oil not only the smell of industry, but also the scent of hope. The hope that their children would live differently from their forefathers, that the nation would no longer be remembered only as a land to be exploited. But it was also here, amid the light of hope, that a long shadow began to appear. For when the country's greatest resource flows strongly into the state, the one who controls the state also begins to control the heartbeat of the economy. In such a case, oil does not merely give power to the nation. It gives enormous power to the center that directs the nation. And when every path of distributing wealth, opportunity, patronage, and development passes through a central gate, then the man holding the key to that gate gradually comes to manage not only the resource. He begins to manage dependence itself. This is the paradox that many resource-rich nations have had to confront. The wealth beneath the earth can help a people lift their heads, but it can also make the power above the earth grow excessively concentrated. For Gaddafi, oil was an instrument of sovereignty, a language of self-respect, the material foundation for grand dreams. But at the same time, oil also helped shape a structure in which the state increasingly stood as the principal distributor of national life. And when the state becomes the great vessel containing nearly every stream of benefit, the one standing at the head of that vessel is very easily seen as the only person who can grant, withhold, or direct the future. Yet in the beginning, what remained most powerfully was still belief. The belief that the desert was no longer only the birthplace of hardship, but also the place where the possibility of rebirth lay hidden. The belief that the black liquid rising from the earth could be transformed into light in a classroom, into medicine in a hospital, into a less crowded roof over a family's head, into a meal with less worry attached to it, into the feeling that a nation had finally learned to use its own wealth, to speak with the world in a firmer and more dignified voice. And perhaps it was precisely here that Gaddafi's dream began to take on another face. Not only the man who reclaimed resources, but the man who wished to use those resources to rewrite the daily life of his people. For oil, by itself, is still only darkness rising from the earth. Only when it touches the school desk of a child, the hospital bed of an elderly person, the shelter over a family, does it truly become a promise that has taken form. From the black substance of sovereignty, the story now moves into the brighter walls of schools, hospitals, and houses raised upon a land of sand, long accustomed to deprivation. There are leaders remembered for their speeches. There are others remembered for war, for nights of meetings that lasted until dawn, for decisions that made the whole world turn its head. But there are also periods in history when what carries a ruler deep into the memory of the people lies not at the podium, but in things much closer to everyday life. A brightly lit classroom where before there had only been dust and sand. A clinic opening in a region once too far from the center. A sturdier roof raised for a family long accustomed to living with want. In the early years after taking power, Muammar Gaddafi not only sought to strengthen Libya, but also to assert its sovereignty. He wanted that strength to appear in forms the people could touch, not in concepts too lofty, but in school desks, in hospital beds, in the key to a house, in the feeling that the life of ordinary people was being drawn farther and farther away from the old barrenness. And it was precisely here that his image in the eyes of many Libyans began to take on another layer. Not only the man who reclaimed a voice for the nation, but the man who wanted to use the nation's resources to rewrite the rhythm of society's daily life. We should pause very slowly over this, for in a land that had grown up amid the desert, long accustomed to distance, to the scarcity of infrastructure, to the feeling that many regions of life had been left behind in silence, schools, hospitals, and housing were not merely structures. There were signs that the state had at last entered the lives of the people with a more tangible hand. When education was expanded and made more freely accessible, what changed was not only the number of classrooms. What also changed was the imagination of families. Their children could go farther than their parents. Learning was no longer a door opened only for a few. The desert was no longer a permanent sentence upon opportunity. So it was with health care as well. A hospital, a doctor, a medicine. On paper, these may be only a line of statistics, but in the memory of the people, they may be the moment when a mother no longer has to travel too far to save her child, when an old man no longer accepts illness as fate, when a community stops seeing pain as something to be endured in silence. A welfare state, if it is truly felt in real life, always carries a very great spiritual force. It makes people believe that this country is not only asking for their loyalty, but is also returning to them a part of their dignity through care and opportunity. And then there was the roof over their heads. A roof may sound small, but for people long accustomed to uncertainty, long living close to tents, long aware of how fragile life can be before nature and history, a roof always means far more than building material. It is a promise of stability. It is the feeling that when night falls, there is a place where one may peacefully close the door. It is the movement from mere existence to settled life. When a government gives its people that feeling, the memory of that period is very difficult to erase, even when history later grows far more complicated. That is why, if we wish to be fair to the portrait of Gaddafi, we cannot tell these years as though they were merely a coat of propaganda and then brush them aside. Many Libyans truly did attach memories of rising, of order, of being supported by the state to the early stage of the regime. They did not only hear talk of revolution, they saw it enter their children's schools, their communities' hospitals, and the policies that supported daily life, which had seemed very far away before. In that atmosphere, Gaddafi was increasingly seen as the man rebuilding the nation through oil. He did not want the resource merely to enrich the treasury. He wanted it to become proof that the new state could care for the people, that national dignity was not only being restored at the negotiating table with the world. Still, he was also being restored in the way a child was educated, a sick person was treated, and a family was allowed to live with a little less hardship. But like every great story of power, light walks beside shadow. For when too many of the good things of life pass through the hand of the state, people more easily attach their gratitude to the center of power. The more schools, hospitals, and roofs bear the mark of the regime, the more the image of the leader becomes not only that of the man administering the nation, but gradually that of the patron of life's order itself. In the beginning, that may create attachment, but over time, it also gives rise to a subtle dependency. People become grateful to the state, while the state becomes increasingly accustomed to being seen as the nearly exclusive source of progress. And perhaps it was precisely here that a deeper movement began to form within Gaddafi's inner life. When a man not only holds power, but is also seen as the one who brings light, services, and support into daily existence, it becomes very easy for an even greater desire to emerge, not only to build the nation through policy, but but also to define the nation through thought, not only to govern reality, but to rewrite the language that explains that reality, not only to build schools and hospitals, but also to offer the people a new political model, a new answer, a new book for the whole society, after the desert had roofs, medicine, and classrooms. Gaddafi still did not see his dream as complete. He wanted to do something even more difficult, to rewrite how power should be understood, how people should be named, and how a nation might move forward without entirely borrowing the language of either the West or the East. In the stillness after those visible works, another dream was beginning to open, a dream bound within the pages of a green book. The army rules some. Some rule by money, by institutions, by tangled networks of interests too intricate to be easily seen. But some are not content merely to hold power in the usual way. They want to do something deeper, bolder, and more dangerous. Redefine power. Muammar Gaddafi, at this stage of his life, seems to have arrived at precisely that threshold. After using oil to rebuild everyday life and make many Libyans feel the presence of schools, hospitals, housing, and the support of the state, he no longer wished to be remembered only as the man who distributed resources or defended sovereignty. He wanted to become the man who wrote his own path for the entire nation, neither fully following the West's footsteps nor bowing to the Soviet bloc's model. He wanted Libya not merely to have a new government, but to possess a new political language, a new dream of how the people and the state ought to meet. And from that aspiration, the Green Book emerged. If we look at it merely as a political document, we will miss its most interesting dimension. For Gaddafi, that book was not simply a collection of opinions. It was something like an attempt to redraw the ideological map of the age. In the 20th century, when the world was sharply divided between Western capitalism and Soviet communism, Gaddafi did not want Libya simply to choose one shadow beneath which to stand. He wanted to establish a third theory, a path said to be more Arab, closer to Islam, more revolutionary in spirit, and above all, not the obedient copy of any other center of power. Here, one can see very clearly a profound trait in his character. Gaddafi was not only fascinated by governing a country, he was fascinated by the idea of creating a historical model. He did not want Libyans merely to live inside a system. He wanted them to believe that they were living inside a great experiment, an experiment of pioneering significance for the entire Arab world, perhaps even for post-colonial humanity as a whole. In that imagination, Libya was no longer a small nation lying in the desert. It could become the place from which a new theory of politics, democracy, society, and the human being would radiate outward. For that reason, the Green Book did not merely criticize a few details of the modern world. It challenged, at its root, the way the world understood power. Gaddafi showed suspicion toward representative democracy, suspicion toward the idea that a people cast their votes every 4 or 5 years and then hand over their voice to another group. In his view, that was not necessarily true democracy. Sometimes it was merely a form in which the masses were stripped of the right to speak directly about their own fate. He advanced the notion that the people must be more directly present in political life, that power should not be confined to parliaments, political parties, or mechanisms that, in the end, only create an intermediary class standing between the people and the state. On the surface, it sounded like a deeply compelling promise to return politics to the masses, and indeed, It is not difficult to understand why such an idea could move so many people. For nations that had once been ruled from outside, that had lived beneath alien and cold machinery, the notion of the people directly holding power sounded like a form of delayed justice. It softened the suspicion that politics is always the game of a few. It made many believe that a model could exist in which the people were no longer merely listeners, but speakers, no longer merely objects to be administered, but subjects with the power to determine their own course. But it is also here, in the brightest light of the ideal, that the first darkness began to take shape. Many systems in history have begun with the promise to return power to the people, and then little by little, what happens is not that the people gain more voice, but that their voice is accepted only when it follows the language the leader has already prescribed. At that point, freedom does not disappear in a single night. It gradually contracts, softly, almost imperceptibly. The people are still called the center. The masses are still invoked as the subject. But the real space for disagreement, for criticism, for speaking in one's own voice, grows narrower and narrower. That is the great paradox of the Green Book. It reveals a Gaddafi who was by no means small in imagination. On the contrary, he thought on a grand scale, with deep passion, with a strong desire to lead Libya out of the dilemma between East and West. He did not accept that his people should merely be students of models written elsewhere. In this there was something genuinely noteworthy. The quality of a man who had grown up amid dust and sand, and yet still wished to take part in the great debate of the world. But at the same time, the book also revealed an increasingly visible danger. When one man is both a political leader and the author of political truth, the distance between thought and personal will begins to blur. And once that distance blurs, power very easily clothes itself in philosophy. It no longer merely gives orders. It begins to explain why those orders are necessary. It no longer merely asks for obedience. It begins to present obedience as part of the proper order of things. It not only builds a system, it also builds a language that makes that system appear natural, legitimate, and almost as though it had been born from the people themselves. In the stillness of those green pages, one can feel something very particular about Gaddafi. He was not a man who wished to be remembered merely as a ruler of the desert. He wanted to be seen as the man who had invented a path. And precisely because that dream was so large, so beautiful in outward appearance, it also began to carry within itself the fragility of an illusion. For there are ideas which, while still resting upon the page, appear like a new well in the middle of the sand. But once brought into life, they may turn into a labyrinth whose entrance is bright, while the way out grows harder and harder to see. The pages had been written, the dream had been named, but the distance from theory to life is always an entirely different road. Just as the promise of water and the pipeline running beneath the sand are never quite the same thing. And then, very slowly, very quietly, Libya would enter a stage in which the dream of the power of the masses no longer rested within the book alone, but began to take the form of committees, congresses, and intricate layers of structure, where the center of power became ever harder to see, and yet fewer and fewer people could truly reach it. There are political dreams that, while still resting upon the lips of the one who first speaks them, sound as beautiful as an oasis appearing at noon beneath the blazing sun. In them, people hear the promise of closeness, of the right to speak, of a new order in which the people no longer stand outside the gates of power. But there are also dreams that, the more they enter life, the more they resemble a mirage upon the sand, bright from afar. Yet the closer one moves toward them, the harder their shape becomes to grasp. Muammar Gaddafi's Jamahiriya was such a dream. After the early years of the revolution, after sovereignty over oil had been asserted more forcefully, after schools, hospitals, housing, and welfare policies had begun to make many Libyans feel that the state had truly entered their lives, Gaddafi did not stop at governing the country within a familiar model. He wanted to do something greater, to turn Libya into a political model of its own, one in which power would no longer be named in the old language of parliaments or parties or presidents in the Western style. He established the concept of Jamahiriya, often understood as the state of the masses, to declare that Libya would not merely have a new government, but an entirely new way of organizing power. Heard at first, it carried a very great fascination. For too many people who once ruled from the outside, who had watched power remain too high, too distant, too cold, the idea that the people would directly take part in determining the nation's course was an alluring promise. In that model, people's congresses, committees, and layers representing the masses were erected like branching veins carrying the will of the people into the heart of the state. On the surface, it was an effort to bridge the distance between people and power, an effort to say that politics should not be the privilege of a professional class, but must become a space where the masses are present in their own voices. And Gaddafi went even further at the symbolic level. He gradually stepped away from ordinary state titles, unwilling to be seen merely as a president or a head of state in the classical sense. He chose to stand in a position that was at once above the system and seemingly outside it, a position revolutionary in character, guiding in tone, closer to the image of a guide than to that of an official within the machinery. This is a detail worth lingering over. When a leader refuses the appearance of formal power, he may create the feeling that he is humbler than power itself. But at times, that very refusal makes power harder to grasp, because it no longer rests neatly inside a finite title. It begins to resemble a presence that is more all-encompassing, more invisible, and more difficult to reach. Here, the great paradox of Jamahiriya reveals itself with striking clarity. In speech, power is dispersed toward the masses. In reality, the center of power grows ever more blurred, yet heavier. It no longer appears simply as the throne of a monarch or the chair of a president. It hides itself within a network of committees, mechanisms, slogans, and layers of political language spoken in the name of the people. And the more such intermediate layers are erected, the harder it becomes to point clearly and ask, who, in the end, holds power? Who truly decides? Who can be questioned? Who can be replaced? When power has a clear face, people at least know who they stand before. But when power dissolves into mechanism, into symbol, into structures that claim everything belongs to the people, what sometimes happens is that no one truly holds it, except a very small, very closed, very difficult to see center. And it is precisely in that difficulty of seeing that power begins to take on the shape of a labyrinth. People may enter that labyrinth believing they are stepping into the common house of the masses. But the deeper they go, the more they realize that the turning paths do not necessarily lead to meaningful participation. They may lead instead to ritual, to language, to the repetition of a will already shaped in advance. Outwardly, everyone is called the subject of power, but more deeply, not everyone has the real ability to affect the center of that power. This is the point at which Gaddafi's political dream begins to take on the beauty of an illusion, not because it had no content at all, nor because people did not once sincerely believe in it, but because the distance between the promise and the living structure of power kept growing wider. The more it was said that power belonged to all, the more difficult it became to exercise actual power. The more it was said that the leader was only the guide of the revolution, the more the presence of the leader came to cover every path of that revolution. The more it promised that the people would speak directly, the more the language they were permitted to use began to resemble the language of the very man who had created the system. There is a very particular sadness in models such as this. It is the sadness of beautiful ideals entering life and gradually learning how to coexist with closure. At first, people built a system to free the masses from the distance of power, but then that same system creates new layers of fog, causing the masses once more to stand before a center too far away to name. Only this time, the distance no longer wears the old crown. It wears the clothing of revolution, speaks in the language of the people, and for that very reason becomes even harder to oppose. Muammar Gaddafi, in this period, appears as a man at once full of political creativity and full of contradiction. He was not content with imported models. He wanted Libya to have its own path. That at one level was an understandable longing of a post-colonial nation, but precisely because he wanted to create that separate path, he increasingly wove a system in which he himself became the indispensable point of reference. And once a system cannot be separated from the shadow of one man, then no matter how beautifully it is named, it begins to grow fragile from within. Even so, in the eyes of not a few Libyans, that period was not yet only a labyrinth. It was still a time of belief, of bright slogans, of congresses, of the feeling that their nation was attempting something no one else had dared in quite that way. History is fairer when we remember that human beings do not live first by the end. They live by the feeling of the present, and at that time, the present still held enough light for many to believe that Libya was walking a distinct, bold path marked by its own dignity. But then, like every dream that grows too large, Jamahiriya could not live by naming alone. A state, if it wishes to endure, must in the end prove itself through very concrete things. Where it leads the country, how it nourishes the land, how it cares for the people, and whether it can turn grand symbols into living currents beneath the sand. From the labyrinth of power, the story now drifts toward another image. Quieter, more beautiful, almost epic. Pipelines moving silently beneath the desert, bringing water to a land long accustomed to drought, as though one man wished to prove that even sand could bloom green if the will behind it were strong enough. Some leaders wish to be remembered through speeches. Others wish to be remembered through victory. But some want to leave upon the face of the earth a mark so tangible that even after words have drifted away, the works remain behind like a kind of memory made of stone, of steel, of pipelines, of water flowing beneath the sand. At this stage of his life, Muammar Gaddafi seemed to want Libya to see him in that way. If before he had used oil to build schools, hospitals, housing, and a sense that the state could touch the lives of ordinary people, now his ambition was moving one step further, not only to improve daily life, not only to reorganize power. He wanted to do something that, for a desert country, sounded almost like myth itself: to carry water through sand. In Libya, Water is not only a resource. Water is fate. Water is the boundary between being able to live and merely enduring. Water is what allows a barren land to open into green, what lets a community put down roots more deeply, what makes the dream of self-reliance appear not only on podiums but in fields, in cities, in the rhythm of an entire nation's life. And for that reason, when the great man-made river project began to take shape, what many Libyans saw was not merely engineering or infrastructure. They saw a very deep declaration of the Gaddafi era. The desert does not have to surrender to destiny. The image of giant pipelines lying beneath the earth has a beauty very much in harmony with the spirit of deep sleep of power, not noisy like battle, not dazzling like a speech platform, only quiet channels, moving through darkness, passing through sand, through rock, carrying fresh water from deep layers closer to human life. There is something almost poetic in that idea, taking what has long been buried in the heart of the earth and using it to nourish the surface of the country once more. As though a nation long made barren were trying to find its own lifeblood beneath the compressed layers of history. For Gaddafi, this project was not merely a development scheme. It was a symbol of will. It was proof that Libya could accomplish great things through its own resources. It was an answer sent to the world that this country did not merely speak of sovereignty through slogans, but could turn sovereignty into structures, into concrete, into pipelines, into water brought to the people. In the psychology of many post-colonial societies, that is something immensely important. After long years of being seen by others as a land of scarcity, dependence, and external definition, the very act of raising a colossal project through national capacity becomes, in itself, a way of restoring self-respect. And from here, agriculture took on a new meaning as well. In a land where sand had long been a more familiar image than green, any effort to expand cultivated land, improve production, and nurture the ambition of self-sufficiency was never merely an economic policy. It was something like a dialogue with nature. Gaddafi did not want Libya to simply grow rich from oil and then live as a consumer nation dependent on the outside world. At least in his imagination, a country with dignity had to know how to stand on its own feet, had to know how to turn resources into productive capacity, had to know how to make the desert yield not only oil, but also harvests, food, and the feeling that the people there were not entirely bound to the harshness of the land. Perhaps that is why this period reveals a very distinctive quality in Gaddafi. He was the kind of leader who liked to think on a grand scale, almost epic in scope. He was not content with small repairs. He wanted to do things large enough to change the nation's self-image. An artificial river in the heart of the desert not only solves the water problem, but also makes people feel that their country can do what once seemed impossible. And sometimes in history, that feeling is nearly as powerful as the work itself. But like every great project, bound to an overly strong center of power, that beauty also carried with it a quiet question. Were those long pipelines beneath the sand enough to replace the bridges missing within the political structure itself? Could a state carry water so far, while at the same time allowing power to flow too narrowly into a single center? Could visible achievements remain durable if the invisible part of the nation, institutions, trust, the ability to correct itself, was increasingly tied to the life and will of one man? These are not questions that diminish the project's value. On the contrary, it is precisely because the project was so large, so beautiful in symbolic terms, that one must ask beneath that beauty, Which part was the enduring strength of the nation, and which part was the strength of an era that could exist only so long as the man who built it still stood at the center of the stage. Even so, if we are to keep faith with the fairness of history, we must still admit that in the eyes of many Libyans, this was the moment when Gaddafi appeared closer to the image of an epic builder than to that of a merely political figure. He gave the desert more water. He gave the idea of self-reliance a visible form. He made the nation not only speak of the future, but try to dig, cast, and raise that future out of the ground itself. And it is often in just such periods of visible success that a person begins to feel larger than the borders of his own nation. When a man has carried water through sand, has made the desert bloom into pride, he very easily begins to believe that his horizon should not end at Libya. If he has once saved one land from drought, then perhaps he can also speak for lands far wider than his own. Beyond the edge of the desert, there remained an Arab world divided, and beyond that a vast continent waiting for someone to step forward and embrace it with dreams of unity and patronage. And from the hidden waterways beneath Libya, Gaddafi's imagination began to flow farther still, toward horizons beyond his own homeland. There are people who, once they step into the center of power, gradually draw inward like kings sitting still within the fortress of their own making. But there are also those who, the more power they hold, the narrower their borders begin to feel. For Muammar Gaddafi, Libya was never truly the final horizon. He did not want merely to be the man steering an oil-rich nation on the edge of the Mediterranean. He wanted more than that. He wanted to become the voice of a larger world, a symbol beyond the map of Libya, a figure who could step from the desert of his homeland into the collective dreams of an entire region, and then farther still into those of a whole continent. At first, that horizon was called Arab unity. This is not difficult to understand. Gaddafi's youth had been lit by Nasser, by the belief that Arab peoples should not remain divided into small, fragile nations, suspicious of one another, or live forever under the influence of outside hands. In his imagination, the Arab world was not merely a collection of neighboring states. It was a body that had been cut apart, a soul that had once been immense, but was then shattered by history into many fragments. And like many people carrying within themselves the pain of the post-colonial condition, Gaddafi believed that dignity could never be fully restored if each nation continued to stand alone in fear and petty calculation. And so, he did not speak only of Libya. He spoke of a wider Arab space, as though he were still trying to join together the broken pieces of an old mirror. The proposals for alliances, the dreams of union, those meetings tinged with an almost epic color, all of them revealed a striking consistency in Gaddafi. He always needed a meaning larger than himself in which to dwell. Power, for him, seems never to have been merely for governing. It had to carry the mission's color. But history rarely yields to dreams of unity that are too vast. The Arab world was not a single riverbed. There were many currents, many regimes, many anxieties, many different instincts for survival. Not every other leader wished to move according to Gaddafi's rhythm. Not everyone saw in him a trustworthy guide. Some viewed him as an unpredictable ally. Some saw Libya as too small to hold so grand a dream. Some listened, but did not believe deeply enough to walk with him to the end of the road. And so, a disappointment began to take shape. It was not loud like a military defeat. It was quieter. It resembled the feeling of a man standing upon a high dune, looking far into the distance, believing he had seen a procession of people moving in the same direction, only to realize when the wind softens that most of them were merely a mirage made by the sun. For Gaddafi, the Arab world did not become the common home he had once hoped for. That dream did not die entirely, but it gradually lost its warmth. And like many people who cannot accept remaining still in emptiness, he turned toward another horizon, broader, wilder, less locked by the expectations of the past. That horizon was Africa. This was not merely a geographical shift in foreign policy. It was a deeper movement in the psychology of power. When the Middle East did not answer the historical role he wanted to assume, Gaddafi looked southward and saw in Africa another stage upon which the dream of leadership could continue to live. Here, he could be more than the head of Libya. He could be a patron, a financier, a connector, a man speaking of the unity of an entire continent that had been divided, plundered, and humiliated by the European empires. If one looks fairly, that turn was not entirely a calculation of vanity. There was a genuine layer of idealism within it. Gaddafi understood very clearly not only Libya's colonial memory, but that of many African peoples. He understood the weight of wounded dignity. He understood the feeling of having one's fate cut apart by someone else's map. And on that level, turning toward Africa could also be seen as an attempt to recover a broader community among lands that had suffered similar wounds. But at the same time, it was precisely here that the theatrical quality of Gaddafi's power became clearer than ever. Desert tents were raised in the middle of international conferences, the brilliant garments, half ritual and half performance. The female bodyguards create an aura, both modern and mythical, and then the title, King of Kings, a way of placing himself that was at once strange, ambitious, and deeply revealing, showing that he no longer wished merely to influence history, but also to stand at the center of history's image. There is something very distinctive about this stage. Gaddafi not only led, but he also performed the role of leadership. He gave politics the appearance of a grand ritual in which symbol, clothing, stagecraft, and personal insignia merged to create a portrait from which the world found it difficult to turn away. And perhaps beneath all those colors there was a loneliness. For there are leaders who, when they cannot truly unify the world, create a stage on which they may still be seen as the center of that world. This is not always a falsehood. At times, it is the way a human being resists the feeling that history has refused to hear him all the way to the end. He adds image, ritual, title, as though reality is not wide enough for his dream. Then at least the symbol may stretch it a little farther. Yet the larger the stage, the harsher the light, and the harsher the light, the easier it is to see the cracks. The period of turning toward Africa shows a Gaddafi who was vivid, many-colored, full of ambition beyond borders. But it also shows that he increasingly needed symbolic grandeur to sustain his power. When a leader must continually stand upon ever larger stages to preserve a historical image of himself, it also means that beneath those stages, certain insecurities have already begun to require concealment in bright light. And outside that light, the Western world was still watching, not with a gentle gaze, not with innocent curiosity, but with the intense stare of great powers long accustomed to judging leaders like Gaddafi through the lens of defiance, unruliness, and danger. When a man raises tents in the theater of global diplomacy, clothes himself in the garments of myth, speaks of continental unity, and plays the role of one who refuses to stand in line, He does not merely make the hall more dazzling. He also calls toward himself colder winds from beyond the horizon, and there would come a time when that many-colored stage would be covered by another kind of light, the light of sanctions, suspicion, bombs, and the long years in which a leader, and with him his entire country, would gradually be enclosed within the suffocating atmosphere of confrontation with the West. There are periods in the life of a leader when power no longer appears as the metallic gleam of the stage, nor does it retain the confidence of grand projects, dazzling summits, or dreams that stretch beyond borders. It grows heavier, darker, like the atmosphere before a desert storm, when the sand has not yet fully risen, but everything has already begun to feel shorter of breath. For Muammar Gaddafi, the years of confrontation with the United States and the West, from the bombing campaign of 1986 to the Lockerbie affair, followed by sanctions and prolonged isolation, were precisely such a period. Shatitude, suffocating, and filled with suspicion, not only for him personally, but for Libya as a whole. If in earlier parts we saw Gaddafi as the man who reclaimed oil, built schools and hospitals, carried water through the sand, and ceaselessly sought a larger stage for himself, then here that portrait changes color. Instead of a man stepping out into the world with the defiant bearing of one who refuses to bow, we begin to see a leader surrounded by confrontation, punishment, and the feeling that every door opening outward leads into cold air. The American bombing campaign of 1986 was not merely a military event. In Libyan psychology, it was understood as a scar. It made confrontation with the West no longer a matter of speeches or slogans, but something real that touched the night, touched the city, touched the feeling that this nation was being placed in the sights of forces far greater than itself. For Gaddafi, this only deepened the image he had long nurtured of himself. The man who would not submit to foreign powers, the man who kept his back straight, even when the sky was filled with the sound of engines from across the sea. And it is precisely here that his appeal to a portion of the people remained. For nations that carry the memory of colonialism, the image of a leader willing to say no, willing to endure isolation rather than kneel, always exerts a very powerful emotional pull. It touches the deepest layers of national self-respect. It makes many people, even if they do not always agree with every decision of the regime, still feel that there is something in its posture that makes their country seem less small in the eyes of the world. But history is not written only by posture. The price also writes it. The Lockerbie affair and the international consequences that followed pushed Libya deeper into that darkness. United Nations sanctions, diplomatic isolation, the feeling that the entire country had been locked inside a circle of suspicion. All of this gave political life and ordinary existence a prolonged sense of confinement. Here, what matters most is to look with both eyes at once. If we look with only one eye, we will see Gaddafi as the victim of Western powers. If we look only at the other, we will see him as the sole agent of tragedy. But the truth, as so often, is heavier and less willing to sleep quietly than that. Gaddafi truly did see himself as a man unwilling to submit to an international order imposed by others. And in that view, he fashioned for himself an almost fated quality. Better to be encircled than tamed. But at the same time, he was also the man who led Libya into a prolonged confrontation in which the people bore the heavier share of decisions far beyond the scale of their daily lives. When sanctions tightened, the ones who suffered weariness were not only the leader in his diplomatic battles of will, They were also the people living in a country growing harder and harder to breathe in, growing more and more cut off from the normal flow of the world, growing more and more accustomed to the feeling of being locked inside a room whose windows opened only to hot wind and suspicion. This is the particular tragedy of nations caught between a leader's ambition and a hostile international order. Self-respect and hardship often walk side by side. A people may be proud that they do not bow, yet still grow weary from living too long under punishment. A leader may believe he is preserving national dignity, yet at the same time cause that very nation to pay for it through difficulty, delay, and loneliness. For Gaddafi, the years of encirclement must also have changed his inner life in ways difficult to put into words. The man who once wanted to redefine politics, who thought on an epic scale, who had expanded his dream from Libya to the Arab world and then down into Africa, was now pushed into a far narrower space. The space of survival, of vigilance, of calculation. In such an atmosphere, power no longer carries the expansive quality of a builder. It contracts, grows harder, more defensive, and once power lives too long in the mentality of siege, it tends to become increasingly suspicious of all difference, both within and without. That is what makes this period especially dark, not only because of bombs or sanctions, but because it imprisoned both the leader and the nation within a closed psychology. The outside world was seen as a threat, and the world within became ever less able to breathe. The atmosphere was not noisy in the manner of total war, but weary in the manner of a room sealed too long. People still lived, still moved, still spoke, but they were gradually deprived of the oxygen of trust. And then, after many years of standing stiff against the wind, perhaps Gaddafi himself also began to understand something that those who live too long in confrontation must sooner or later understand. There are moments when, if one does not bend, one will break. There are moments when a voice grown too hard, if held that way forever, will echo only against the walls one has built oneself. After years of storms, the desert does not soften at once. Still, people begin to hear another sound, quieter, lower, less defiant, as though a man once accustomed to speaking in strong winds were slowly learning how to lower his voice, not because his ambition had ended, but because he wished to continue through the age with something just a little softer. Some people spend their entire lives accustomed to walking into headwinds, speaking in the high register of defiance, standing in the middle of the storm while keeping their backs straight, as though concession were a form of betraying themselves. But history, like the desert, has its strange seasons. There are times when, to keep going, one cannot merely resist the wind. One must learn how to shift with it, to bend a little, to lower the voice a little, and to use softness as another form of survival. For Gaddafi, the early 2000s were such a period, a stage in which the man once famous for confrontation began to speak in a lower, softer, more pragmatic voice. In keeping with the outline, this is the moment when his portrait loses one color. He is no longer only a man who knows how to resist, but also one who knows how to retreat, how to bargain, how to adjust to survive. After many years of sanctions, suspicion, and being surrounded by the chill of confrontation with the West, Libya, too, seems to have reached the limits of isolation. A nation can endure many things out of self-respect, but it cannot live forever in a besieged state of mind without wearing down. Gaddafi must have seen that. He understood that if he continued speaking to the world only in the language of challenge, Libya would become increasingly locked inside the very shadow created by the years before. And so, rather than remaining frozen in place like an unyielding symbol, he began to move. That movement did not take place like a confession. It unfolded like a long bargain. Libya gradually reconciled with the West. Gaddafi agreed to abandon the program of weapons of mass destruction. He compensated for Lockerbie. He opened the country more to international investment. He cooperated in the war on terror. Seen from afar, all these steps looked like a very clear change in tone. The man who once preferred to stand outside the circle of international order was now beginning to knock on the door to come closer to it again. But if one looks more deeply, this was not exactly a surrender. It resembled a certain pragmatism of power. When a leader has lived long enough, he learns that not every battle must be won through confrontation. There are times when one must win by knowing when to yield to preserve the core. For that reason, this period makes Gaddafi more complex. Many years earlier, he had appeared as a man of great slogans, of the desert and dignity, of continental stages and words, unafraid of collision. Now he was still the same man, but one who had learned to speak in the language of negotiation. Still, the man who had fashioned himself into a symbol of resistance to foreign powers, but also one lucid enough to understand that if he wished to survive in a world that had changed, he too had to change the way he appeared before it. Perhaps this is one of the most thought-provoking moments in the life of power, when one realizes that hardness does not always mean immobility, and that sometimes only those who are flexible can extend the life of their reign a little longer. At first glance, it looked like a new dawn. The doors to investment opened. The diplomatic air grew less thick. Libya no longer seemed entirely locked inside the room of punishment. Many people may have felt that the country was entering another stage. Less tense, less confrontational, perhaps easier to breathe within. But history is often cunning. It rarely allows a great crack to appear at once in the place where the light is brightest. More often, it is precisely when people think they have stepped into a quieter morning that the hidden fractures beneath become clearer than ever. So it was with Libya as well. While Gaddafi adjusted his voice toward the outside world, within the country, certain things had lasted too long to be changed by a few gestures of reconciliation. Power had stretched on for too many years. Society had grown accustomed to silence for too long. Fear, like fine dust inside a house, had settled into too many corners of life, and the distance between the state and the people, a distance once partly covered by earlier achievements, by stability, by welfare, by national pride, was now no longer so easily concealed as before. In keeping with the spirit of the outline, this is the point that must be held very slowly. Outwardly, things seemed warmer, but inwardly, the cracks were growing deeper. That is the sorrowful paradox of this period. Gaddafi knew how to adjust to survive in the world, but he no longer seemed to possess, or perhaps no longer wished to possess, the ability to renew the foundation of the relationship between himself and Libyan society. A leader can sign agreements with the outside world far more quickly than he can heal the silence accumulated within his own country. He can open the door to flows of capital, but not easily reopen the space of trust. He can change his tone with the West, but not easily alter a structure of power that has hardened into habit over decades. And so, beneath the softer layer of diplomacy, the hard, aging core of the regime remained almost untouched. Perhaps that is why this period should not be told as a story of redemption, nor as a simple disguise. It is a very real gray zone in political life, a place where one man showed considerable capacity for adaptation, yet also revealed his own limits. Gaddafi was no longer only the man of the stormy night. He had learned how to walk in a gentler light. But the cost of living too long at the center of power is this: even when the voice softens, the shadow cast behind remains very long. And a shadow that grows too long will sooner or later reach lands that no longer wish to remain silent. For beneath the surface of reconciliation, beneath the handshakes, beneath the breathing rhythm of international relations that seemed at last to have become less urgent, there remained inside Libya layers of dissatisfaction compressed over many years. They lay there like heat beneath the daytime sand, not always visible, but never truly gone. And then there would come a season when the wind changed direction across the Arab world, and what had been held down too long would no longer remain still beneath the ground. When that moment came, the man who had once learned to speak more softly to the world would have to face a far more violent language rising from his own country. There are forms of power that pass through human life like a mountain range, standing there for so long that many begin to think they belong to the landscape, to fate, to an order that cannot be changed. But history never stands completely still. There are seasons when, from very far away, the wind begins to shift. At first it is only a vague rustling. Then that sound spreads across many borders, across many squares, across many hearts that have kept silent for too long. And in time, even regimes that seem to have turned to stone must hear the sound of fracture rising from below. Libya entered that upheaval amid the Arab Spring. But to understand this final stretch fairly, we should not tell it as a wave coming entirely from outside. The Arab world was indeed in motion at that moment. Indeed, images of uprisings, protests, and regime change in other countries ignited a fire that spread quickly. But in Libya, that fire was not carried in by outside winds alone. It also burst upward from the layers of resentment that had been compressed too long within the country itself. The memory of Abu Salim, dissatisfied regions such as Benghazi, the suffocating feeling of a society that had lived too long in fear, the widening distance between the state and the people, between the symbol of revolution and the real lives of people who no longer felt themselves fully heard. Perhaps that is the most painful thing in every great collapse. It rarely comes from a single cause alone. It comes when scattered complaints can no longer remain separate, when old wounds meet new anger, when fear is no longer strong enough to keep the crowd inside the house. When achievements that were once real are no longer sufficient to cover the weariness of a society that has lived too long beneath the same shadow. And at that point, a regime no longer faces resistance alone. It faces the truth that the very things it accumulated to survive are also the things that gradually prepared the ground for its final crisis. In Libya, the regime's response did not calm the wave. It drove everything into darker waters more quickly. Repression, clashes, hard words, and wounds between the state and the people are growing deeper and deeper. What might once have remained within the sphere of political dissatisfaction gradually slipped toward civil war. Benghazi was no longer merely a place name. It became a symbol of fracture. Tripoli was no longer only the center of power. It became the stronghold that had to be held at all costs. And Sirte, the stretch of sand bound to Gaddafi's beginnings, also slowly entered the shadow of the ending, like a final point of fate waiting from very far away. At this turning point, the outside world once again entered the Libyan story. no longer merely through sanctions or diplomatic suspicion alone, but through military intervention, through NATO, through strategic calculations spread across the sky of a civil war tearing the country in two. For many who supported Gaddafi, this was the final proof that Libya was once more being torn open by a fate imposed from outside. For many who opposed him, it was the moment when the regime had to pay the price for the closure and violence that had accumulated for too long. The truth, as so often, does not rest wholly on one side. Gaddafi was not simply a victim of international intervention. If we told it that way, we would flatten the entire depth of Libya's tragedy. The very way he had concentrated power over so many years, the way the regime handled dissent, the structure of fear that had sunk deep into society, all of that also helped create the collapse that eventually consumed it. But on the other hand, the story cannot be told as though everything were merely the pure result of internal mistakes. From early on, Libya had been placed within a game larger than itself, where the winds of geopolitics, international interests, and outside intervention continually made the crisis more violent, harder to control, and in the end, more ruthless toward ordinary civilians. That is the tragedy of many nations. When both regime and world push a country toward rupture, it is always the people who bear the heaviest price. Those final years, therefore, should not be told in too loud a voice. There is no need for noise. One only has to slow down slightly to see that within them, too many things were collapsing at once. A myth of power, an order that had lasted for decades, a promise of stability, a Sirte belief in the ability to control history through personal will, and even the image of a man who had once thought he could rewrite the fate of a region. Tripoli fell. Sirte became the final fortress, and then, in a paradox almost built into the structure of tragedy itself, the man who had once wanted to stand between the Arab map and Africa as a figure of his age ended by returning to the very stretch of sand where his life had begun. There is something harsh, yet ancient, in that circle. From the tent of sand to power, from power back to the desert, from the dream of uniting vast worlds to a road growing shorter and shorter amid the smoke, fire, and dust of Sirte. History sometimes does not need to create symbols on purpose. It creates them by itself. And that image? A man who had once raised grand projects, spoken very grand words, lived upon the great stage of the 20th century, now pulled back to the sand of his point of origin, is one of the saddest images of power, for it reminds us that there are people who can build an entire age around themselves, yet cannot build a gentle exit once that age turns its back on them. And yet even here, the story of Gaddafi still cannot be closed with a simple sigh, for he did not leave behind ruin alone, nor did he leave behind only slogans that had gone silent. He left behind a far more complicated legacy, questions of sovereignty, of national dignity, of achievements that were once real, of the value of a strong state, and also of the limits of power when it identifies itself for too long with the fate of an entire nation. After the dust of Sirte, after the final sounds of an era, there remain questions that refuse to lie still. And perhaps to hear them more clearly, we must walk a little more slowly still. Slowly, as one does when the night has grown very deep. To look back not only at how a man fell, but also at what that life still says to our age today, about sovereignty, achievement, and the limits of human power. Let the night slow down a little more, slowly, like the desert wind after a long day, finally lowering its voice, no longer lashing sand across the earth, like an unfinished argument, but only passing over tents, over stones, over old roads, as though history itself has grown weary and wishes to sit down and rest. And in that stillness, now that the story of Muammar Gaddafi has nearly completed its circle, from the tent of sand in childhood to oil, schools, political dreams, the water pipes beneath the earth, continental stages, the years of encirclement, and then the road back to Sirte. Perhaps what remains most valuable is not a verdict too short, but a few questions deep enough to accompany us into 2026. In keeping with the spirit of the outline, this final part must preserve its slowness, depth, and fairness, while drawing out 3 layers of lessons about sovereignty, achievement, and the limits of power. First of all, Gaddafi reminds our age of something very old that the modern world often forgets too quickly. For people once humiliated by colonialism, sovereignty is never only a line on a map. Sovereignty is also the right to keep one's own resources, the right to speak of oneself in one's own language, the right not to bow one's head inside the house of one's ancestors. There are people born in countries that were strong from the beginning, and so they regard independence as something self-evident, like air that has always been there. But for lands that were once trampled upon, once stripped not only of wealth but of dignity, sovereignty is a feeling that nearly touches the skin. It does not live only in conferences. It lives in memory. It lives in inherited pain. And perhaps that is why figures like Gaddafi, however controversial they may be, once possessed such immense appeal, because they spoke directly to a hunger deeper even than economics, the hunger to stand upright. That lesson remains deeply real in the year 2026, for the world today may display fewer colonial flags, but that does not mean it has fewer subtle forms of dependence. Armies may no longer occupy a nation, and yet still be dependent through capital, through technology, through discourse, through the way others define what is civilized, what is backward, what deserves to be heard, and what ought to remain silent. And so, if we look fairly, Gaddafi compels us to remember that the longing of nations for self-determination is not some outdated, emotional impulse. It is a profoundly human reflex among communities that do not wish to live forever beneath someone else's voice. And sometimes, the very act of reminding humanity that national dignity is also a real need is itself a legacy that cannot be entirely denied. But history does not preserve ideas alone. It also preserves what was actually built. On the second level, Gaddafi leaves us a lesson about the achievements of a state with a very strong will. Whether or not one agrees with his entire regime, it remains difficult to deny that the story of Libya under his rule once demonstrated something important. When national resources are drawn back to the center of power and used with great determination, a country can change its face very quickly. Infrastructure can be expanded. Education, healthcare, housing, water, and symbols of national self-respect can all be advanced at a pace that makes many people feel they are living through an age of ascent. That is something the outline emphasized very clearly. Gaddafi showed that the state, if it possesses will and resources, can turn natural wealth into schools, hospitals, public works, and a feeling that the nation is no longer abandoned amid dust and sand. For 2026, that lesson is still worth hearing in silence. For today, some societies speak endlessly of markets, of speed, of growth, yet sometimes forget a simple question. Is state power ultimately being used to make ordinary life less fragile? Do the numbers reach the classroom, the hospital bed, clean water, the roof overhead, and the sense of dignity of a nation? At this point, Gaddafi's life compels us to be fair. Some achievements were real. Some memories of stability were real. Some people truly saw, during that period, not only slogans but also material support for their lives. Mature history is history that dares to look at this without fearing complexity. But then, from that very point, we enter the third layer, perhaps the saddest, deepest, and most important one, for the sleep of this age: the limits of power. Gaddafi leaves behind a very important warning, that when a human being identifies himself with the nation for too long, even the greatest achievements may become fragile, not because those achievements were unreal, but because their deeper foundations were never anchored in institutions strong enough, open enough, and capable enough of surviving after the shadow of the man who built them has left the stage. If every current of national life, from resources, welfare, thought, and symbol, to the feeling of stability itself, passes through a center that is too personal, then one day, when that center begins to tremble, everything that once seemed firm will tremble with it. In keeping with the spirit suggested by the outline, some people can carry water through the desert, yet still fail to build a bridge strong enough between power and the limits of their own humanity. That is perhaps what Gaddafi teaches in 2026 in the saddest voice of history, that to love sovereignty is necessary. It is necessary to build a nation. It is necessary to use resources to help people rise. But if power gradually comes to believe that only it is the nation, that only it understands the people, that only it can preserve order, then from that very moment, achievement has already begun to carry the seed of fragility. A leader may save a nation from many pressures from outside, and yet still fail to save himself from the shadow that power casts upon the inner life. And when that shadow grows too long, it does not cover only the ruler. It also covers the nation's future. And so, if we must close this story with a gentle lullaby for the late hour, perhaps we should say this: some lives cannot be told only through love or hatred. There are people who both build and destroy, who both raise a nation to its feet and help lead it into collapse. And there are destinies, like Gaddafi's, that leave behind not only dust, but also questions that take a very long time to fall asleep. Tonight, as the breathing grows slower, perhaps what remains is not the noise of controversy, but a quieter understanding. Power is only beautiful when it knows how to limit itself. Sovereignty is only durable when it walks together with institutions, and achievement only truly lives long when it is not bound too tightly to the life of a single human being. Out there, the wind still moves across the Libyan desert, as it has moved through so many centuries. It covers the footprints of warriors, shepherds, kings, revolutionaries, and the defeated. But there are some questions that even sand cannot bury. They remain in the night, very softly, very deeply, like a reminder to our age that between sovereignty and power, between construction and the human being, between dream and limit, there must always be a lucidity gentle enough not to destroy the very things we are trying to save.